I'm Frederick Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
Yes, you are the advocate, Leilani, and you are advocating a lot, and I think that's pretty cool. And you are running, what is it called, the Shift? What is that?
It is called the Shift.
Yeah.
It's a mighty little organization challenging the structures and systems that are making cities unlivable places for a lot of people and making housing very expensive.
Because, you know, we've been doing this podcast, the Pushback Talks, for, is it 4 years?
It is.
Yeah. So we started in the midst of the pandemic, and then people ask me, what is she doing? It's like, what are they doing in the bank after 3 when the bank is closing the offices? You know, it's like this kind of, do they really work? You know? So this episode, or actually like a mini-series of episode, is going to look into what is Leilani actually doing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a little series. Well, on a piece of
You look confused
work.
when I say this.
No. It's a mini series of episodes
of what Leilani is actually doing.
A part of what I'm doing, yeah.
So I think this is really cool because you have created the Shift Directives. I don't really know so much about them, but we're going to find out. But the cool thing is that with these directives, you're going to hand them over to governments, local governments, national governments, politicians, unions, tenants, activists, as a tool for change, a legal tool for change, which I think is, I mean, as you are a human rights lawyer, so why don't you give us some directives?
Exactly.
I think that's cool.
Exactly.
So you've been working on this for quite a few years. Tell me about your directives.
Yeah, so it was the first thing I did when I finished being the UN Special Rapporteur. I had a fellowship funded by the Open Society to take human rights law and show the ways in which it needs to be applied to make housing livable for everyday people, to ensure that housing isn't too expensive, to ensure that investors aren't ruining housing for especially the younger generation. And so I came up with my colleague Sam Freeman. We came up with 10 directives. We tried to keep it sharp, 10 directives, and they are a range. You know, we go from looking at what we need to protect tenants all the way to how to regulate international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, right? So it's the whole scope from the ground to the people up in the clouds.
So, dear listeners, this is the chance for you to really get strong arguments to put in the face of the people of power in your country. It's good arguments, and I think we need also legal arguments for why we need a better world around our homes. So the first directive, I read it here, shift to human rights-based housing framework. It's good, but I mean, you and Sam, you have recorded some notes for us to take on. So maybe we should just go and listen to Leilani, Farha, and Sam Freeman, interviewed by Kirsten McRae, who is also the producer of this podcast. So enjoy.
The housing crisis is one of the most pressing challenges of our time. The cost of renting or buying a home has far outpaced wage growth in countries around the world, a pattern that has only intensified with the pandemic. It's driving inequality and making cities unaffordable for the people who make them thrive. The causes of this global crisis are many, but the financialization of the residential real estate market plays a huge role. Within the current model, investors use homes to make as much money as possible, while governments are often passive or even skew the market rules to favor the interests of big investors. But housing should not be treated as just another tool for speculation. It's a basic human right and an essential element of everyone's life. The Shift Directives are the first ever comprehensive framework providing governments and investors with guidance to effectively address the financialization of housing in accordance with human rights law. And that is what we're here to discuss today. What this framework is, why it works, and what it could look like in practice. But before we get into that discussion, I want to set the stage a little bit for the listeners. Sam, Leilani. So Leilani, you finished your tenure as Special Rapporteur in April of 2020 and created The Shift, which was created to fill a very specific gap that you saw in those 6 years as Special Rapporteur. You observed that not only is there this big disconnect between the people who are creating housing policy, which is often done at a high level of government, and the people who are most impacted by it, but you also observed poor communication, or maybe non-existent communication, between the different parts of government that are responsible for carrying out this existing housing law and policy. So you set out to address these breakdowns that you saw and to advocate for the full implementation of the human right to housing, which would naturally address those gaps. Listeners who have seen Push the Film will likely be familiar with this, as the birth of The Shift and what inspired it are a big part of the film. But our listeners are likely a little less familiar with the person that is next to you on my screen, who is Sam Freeman. Hi, Sam.
Hi, I'm back.
You're back.
I've been on this podcast before, and it was one of the most embarrassing experiences of my life. So I'm hoping this will be a better introduction to the listeners of Pushback Talks.
Oh, yeah. Hopefully less embarrassing for you this time. So you two have been working together for a very long time. I don't actually even know how long it's been. How long have you actually been working together?
I first met Leilani. I was doing a master's at the University of Ottawa, and Leilani came and presented at a class that I was doing with one of my professors. It was on international human rights law. So that was my first time I met Leilani. That was probably 2017, 2018, maybe. I can't quite remember. But yeah, that was my
No, it was
first
before
time.
then.
Was it?
It was before then, Sam, because we started the research on the financialization of housing with a memo that you wrote that was so good. It was the best memo I'd ever received. And we started that research in 2016.
It must have. Well, I moved to Canada in September 2016. So it must,
right. So it must have been just
that.
after that.
Yeah,
That's right.
Whoa. And
So
now
it's been
here
a
you
long
are.
time. Yeah.
And she hasn't been able
Yeah.
to shake me off since.
No, I poached Sam, and he ended up working with me when I was UN Special Rapporteur as one of my researchers, and has been instrumental in all of the work I've done on the financialization of housing. I mean, we're now just in step with each other. We do this together. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And now you're the head of research and tenant advocacy, which is your official title, which I sometimes forget your official job title. Then I go look at it and I'm like, oh, that's a cool job.
Oh, so do I. So don't, you're not the only one.
So then was there a certain point at which the two of you conceived of the Shift Directives together? What was that moment and how did you get there?
Oh my gosh.
That's a really tough
Well, it's not a big question.
I pitched the Shift Directives as a fellowship with the Open Society Foundation. I think that they came out of the financialization report that I wrote as UN rapporteur. And I think Sam and I would have been discussing the fact that we needed something to get this issue out and get more accountability for the financialized landlords. Beyond that, I can't really remember.
I remember having a conversation and us realizing that there's so many frameworks out there that benefit investors, but there's nothing out there that really benefits human rights or benefits tenants. And then seeing the direction that housing investment was going and realizing this is such a critical thing to have out there, such a critical document to produce to ensure that tenants are protected, that housing systems are protected, this kind of more meta look at it, and then thinking, who better really to produce that document than Leilani Farha, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur, but also the person who has really popularised the understanding of financialisation being this critical issue. So, yeah.
And one of the things, too, that I think both Sam and I have been super conscious of is that the way in which housing systems are allowed to run and the way in which they've been created is a major contributor to gross inequality in most cities and societies around the world, and yet it's not discussed that way. So there's lots of, people talk about all the different drivers of inequality, and they very rarely will talk about, like you take Oxfam, right? Oxfam has really focused in on income inequality. They release a report every year around the Davos conference, and they don't talk about where this income is being generated from. Where is Uber wealth based? And I think Sam and I both had the sense of we want to expose the role that residential real estate and investment in it is playing in gross inequality around the world.
Yeah. That's a really good segue to kind of move into the directives themselves a bit more. And so we're going to be talking about 3 of them today. Directive 1 is shift to a human rights-based housing framework. I'll bring that up to my family and friends, and then they're immediately, well, what exactly does that even mean? And I know that can be quite a large question, but when we say a human rights approach to housing, can you give us a broad overview of what that entails and how that's a critical shift from previous frameworks?
Well, I mean, a human rights approach is, obviously putting it too simply, but it's an approach that centralizes the realization of human rights, places the realization of human rights as the objective of that approach. I mean, it means running housing systems, designing housing systems with a view to achieving the full realization of human rights as that's set out under international law. Taking a human rights approach really kind of speaks to a full systems shift. It's a recognition that what we currently have is wholly inadequate and is leading to more harm than good. Well, I'm constantly kind of driven by, which is included in the directives, and it's something I repeat ad nauseum to anyone who will listen, this quote from the book In Defense of Housing by David Madden and Peter Marcuse, this idea that talking about us experiencing a housing crisis is, in some senses, a strange conceptualization of what we are experiencing, because to say something's in crisis implies that you're experiencing this kind of temporary deviation from an otherwise functioning normality. But that's not what we're seeing in all countries around the world. If we look at the factors we ascribe to crisis, things like unaffordability, unavailability, evictions, homelessness, those aren't temporary and they're not deviations, right? They're symptoms of a system working exactly how it is intended to work. A financialized system that privileges profit over people. And so taking a human rights approach removes that. It takes that away. It says, no, people come first. Housing comes first. And for me, that's what the human rights approach is, and grounding that in these human rights standards and norms that have been articulated for decades by people like Leilani and others, that we have a wonderful understanding of what housing should look like within a human rights approach. Yeah.
And now you know why I work with the guy. You nailed it. That was so good. That was so good what you said, Sam, and I obviously completely agree. We at the Shift imagine a world where housing systems produce equality, where housing systems produce security, human security, where housing systems produce societies that have no homelessness, right?
Right.
And I mean, it's really a flip of where we're at right now. And that's why we think human rights is such a game changer, because it requires a complete reset of our housing systems so that systems produce social good and create happier cities and happier people. I mean, and Sam knows this better than most because he works so directly with tenants. But, if you talk to a tenant these days, the stress and anxiety they experience on a day-to-day basis, they're living in an affordable place. Is the building going to be bought by one of these actors? And if so, what's going to happen? Or they're living in a place that has been bought by one of these financialized actors, and they're wondering when their rent is going to increase and by how much, and will they be able to afford it? Or they're already subject to increased rents and they know that they can't afford it, and they're wondering when they're going to fall behind on their rent and be evicted into complete insecurity and potentially facing homelessness. I mean, in a lot of societies, people who are renting are some of the lowest income people in that society. And so an eviction or an increase in rent is incredibly destabilizing. And so at the Shift, we're trying to envision a world where people don't have to suffer that feeling of insecurity and those anxieties, because you know what happens when you're anxious like that and when you're dealing with that. How do you then cope with all the other things in life that are anxiety inducing and problematic and just the struggle of life, right? So that's kind of the vision of human right, is to create fairer, more secure, happier places.
Yeah, that's something that when I first began working with you, it was such a simple but also a profound shift in perspective that I was astonished that more people, when I would speak to them about it, and I would just kind of phrase it simple as like, imagine if things were different in this way. And it was so many people hadn't even considered that. They were like, oh, that actually sounds beautiful and incredible. And I never thought to, deprioritize profit. I've been, raised in a world where I'm meant to respect someone else's profit or their path to profit and not really think much about the, cast on effects to other people, even if they're incredibly vast.
Exactly. And I'll just add one thing, Kirsten. I mean, in the Shift Directives, Directive 1, we we start right with, you have to shift to this framework. But what we say very clearly as well is that governments need to put this in legislation. Whether it's a constitution or whether it's just a legislated right to housing, that is a huge game changer. And governments are really loath to do it because they don't want to be held accountable. But the impact of just the recognition of the right to housing in legislation is huge. It signals to everyone in society, everyone, people living in homelessness, renters struggling, but also investors. It signals this is how we as a society value housing. We value it as a human right, not as a commodity. And we wanted to put that up front and center, even though it's a very tough ask and demand. That being said, there are 80 constitutions in the world or something like that that do include the right to housing. So it's not unheard of. Certainly most countries in the European Union have the right to housing in their constitution. It's not always justiciable. It hasn't always had life breathed into the provision, but it exists. And we're starting to see other orders of government take seriously the right to housing and put it in, let's say, local housing strategies, for example. And I remember in Canada when the right to housing was enshrined in legislation for the first time in 2019, very recently. I was working for an anti-poverty organization, and the board of directors was made up of people living in poverty. And I remember the chair of the board calling me and saying how meaningful it was to her. She was crying. She had lived in terrible conditions as a single mother. And just to see her government recognize that what she was complaining about and advocating for was legitimate when she had felt completely illegitimate all of those years. So just to say, it's super meaningful.
Yeah, I think it answers the question, like that kind of governmental level. It answers that completely fundamental question, who's housing for? If you enshrine the right to housing, housing's for people. If you don't enshrine the right to housing, if you don't recognize the right to housing, housing's for profit, and it will be taken that way. So yeah, it's such a powerful thing to do.
I got goosebumps. I love that. So we're going to zoom out a little bit. So we were talking about government and enshrining the right to housing in law. But I want to zoom out a little bit further to look at international mechanisms, because we have Directive 9, which is strengthen international, regional, and industry accountability mechanisms. So can you speak a little bit to the role that international bodies play in a more local context? So we have, a national government, but then we also have these international structures. A lot of people don't know what they are or how they interact with national governments. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, the point of Directive 9, there's sort of twofold. One, it's to say that national level governments, states, as we call them in the international system, have the primary responsibility with respect to implementing the human right to housing. And so they got a job to do, and they got to do it. And that includes regulating third-party actors like financial investors in housing, corporations, pension funds investing in housing, insurance companies, all of the various actors who have their fingers in the pie, regulating Airbnb as a form of investor, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, et cetera. So that was part of Directive 9. But then there are these bodies that actually hold states accountable to their international human rights obligations. And we wanted to make sure that those regional and international accountability bodies took seriously the right to housing and took seriously the financialization of housing. Because often those bodies might look at, is the state providing social housing? But wouldn't necessarily look at the whole housing system and the way in which finance is playing a role in that system. And so we really wanted to encourage some of those bodies to engage in this accountability, to engage in holding states accountable. So examples of international and regional accountability bodies are things like, so at the UN, in the United Nations, there's a committee system. And the committees are responsible for reviewing whether states are meeting their international human rights obligations. There happens to be one committee called the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it really monitors the right to housing, among other social and economic rights. And so we really wanted to encourage the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to hold states accountable with respect to the financialization of housing. So when a state comes up for review, they would be asking that state, you have an affordability crisis. What are you doing about that? And have you looked at the role of financial actors in the affordability crisis? And are you going to regulate them? Are you going to make sure that they don't make your housing system unaffordable for those on low income, for example? What is their contribution to homelessness? Are they contributing to homelessness? Homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. So what are you doing to control for that and make sure that you don't allow for the creation of homelessness, which is a violation of international law? So that's actually some work that the Shift is intending to do, hopefully sometime soon, which is to actually engage that international body, for example, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to encourage them and to provide them with the information that they might need to hold different states accountable. They meet twice a year and they review 5 states at every session. So there will be states that we will furnish the committee information about those states. We will furnish information to the committee about certain states being reviewed so that they are better equipped to really examine financialization. At the European level, there's big news just announced. There is a new first ever housing commissioner whose role seems to be tied with energy as well, which is energy poverty is a huge issue across the European Union. People, are paying exorbitant amounts of money to heat their homes and cool their homes. And that's a huge issue. It's an issue for the environment as well. So we don't know exactly what the commissioner is going to do and what their focus will be. He's Danish, which is good news because Denmark has some very interesting laws around financialization of housing, actually trying to curb it. Maybe he is, attuned to the issue, but we would certainly be recommending that as a housing commissioner, he use a human rights framework to guide his work. I see human rights as really useful in that regard. And maybe Sam can talk to the way in which human rights can act as a kind of guidance for someone like a commissioner.
Yeah, that was the Lex Blackstone law? Was that
That's right.
Denmark? Okay. That passed just as I joined the Shift.
Maybe Sam,
so
explain what the Lex Blackstone law is.
Yeah, I got to rack my memory to remember. I mean, but Denmark introduced a law which I think is colloquially known as the Blackstone law, and it's intended to tackle what was then at least the existing practice of financialized landlords, where they would take over a property, renovate that property, and then hike the rents up. And it basically said that they're not allowed, having purchased a property, they're not allowed to engage in renovations. I think engage in renovations that would lead to rent increases within 5 years. Yeah. It only applies to properties that were built after a certain date.
Or they can renovate, but they can't jack up the rent.
Exactly, yeah. So they can't tie rent increases to renovation for a period of 5 years after purchasing a property. And it also introduced a set of kind of stronger tenant protections, I think, including kind of engagement with tenants for landlords.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think a great example of, like you said, you can create an environment that encourages, predatory investment, or you can create an environment where it's not profitable enough for them to remain in that industry or in that business.
Yeah.
I did have one thing I wanted to jump back to, because Leilani, you used the term prima facie, and I just wanted you to explain what that is.
Yeah, it means that no matter what way you slice it, it is a violation of the right to housing on its face. There's no defense, right? Homelessness is clearly a violation of the right to housing because people don't have a home.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Very straightforward, to the point. Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought from context, but it's something that I see all the time. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I know what that means from context, but wanted to hear it straight from you. And so we were talking about investment. And so we're also talking about Directive 10, which is ensure international financial institutions and frameworks adhere to human rights standards. And financial institutions are interesting. We can say that they have contributed to the financialization of housing, or caused it. So can you provide any examples of how it has impacted the right to housing, or impacted housing in general? I know everyone has seen the phrase financialization of housing. Basically, that's something that you greatly popularized. How would you describe or explain the financialization of housing to someone who's never heard of it before?
It's the shifting of the purpose of a home from a place where people can live in peace and security and in dignity to purely, or kind of its main characteristic being a financial investment, an investment for a developer, an investor, a landlord, a vehicle for them increasing their wealth. I think it's where the housing is run in a way where the fiduciary duty that an investor owes to their shareholders is privileged over any other duties, including human rights duties that they may owe to tenants.
Okay. And then, so when we say international financial institutions, what exactly are we speaking about? Is that corporations? Are there other, what does that mean exactly?
I think it's quite specific, really. I mean, it means international banks like the World Bank and the IMF. And, history has shown what these institutions have done. I mean, they're pretty horrifically neoliberal in their approach, and they will issue loans to particular countries. And as for the terms of that loan will be, the country has to commit to certain policy and legislative shifts, which may include and have included the privatization of public services, including housing. In some instances, selling off public housing to investors.
So it almost shifts the entire global system in favor of the desires or the desired outcomes of the wealthiest people, because they're able to exercise control or influence within these institutions.
That's right. And I mean, if you look at the IMF, it is made up of governments, and their role is to support economic policies that promote financial stability and monetary cooperation, essential to productivity. And so what Sam was saying, as I understand it, is they have a neoliberal frame. Neoliberalism is where you allow markets to do what markets will do, and government should step back and not regulate and not legislate. And it is a system that really privileges investors, basically. And the IMF has taken positions that are directly counter to human rights. One of my colleagues, Philip Alston, who was the special rapporteur on extreme poverty when I was rapporteur on the right to housing, he's a human rights guru, and he called the World Bank human rights free zone. And I mean, I would say the IMF is the same. During the global financial crisis, we'll remember that countries like Greece implemented austerity measures, and those austerity measures were imposed on them by the IMF. And as a result, and we say this in the directives, of austerity measures, governments tended to rely on their real estate sector to kind of bail themselves out. So you see a country like Greece, for example, Spain, doing things like liberalizing their housing system further. So getting rid of things like rent caps and rent controls, allowing investors to come in and purchase as a supposed cash flow remedy, and creating things like golden visa programs whereby someone with a lot of money could purchase a property and then become a resident or a citizen of the EU. And so there's a direct line between the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund, and the financialization of housing. And that's what we're trying to deal with in Directive 10, to say that they should actually recalibrate their policies and their advice and their requirements of governments so that they produce human rights outcomes through their economies, not this financialized model of an economy that benefits a few people and really disadvantages so many people. And we threw in the World Bank there because the World Bank lends to governments to create mortgage-based housing systems, for example. And in contexts where mortgage-based housing systems don't make sense, I visited countries where mortgage-based housing systems are being put in place as if they are social housing. And they're like in Egypt, they called their mortgage-based housing system social housing, but the poorest people couldn't access it because you needed a deposit, a down payment, like a typical mortgage-based housing system. And what that does is it just creates an indebted society, right? And while I think we've sort of managed in North America, for example, and Western Europe with mortgage-based systems, when you're dealing with developing countries in the global South, it is clear that a mortgage-based system is intended to kickstart an economy, to create this cash flow, et cetera, but it's not clear who it's benefiting at the low end. It's not benefiting people at the low end, people with no income or people with extremely low income.
So we're actually, I can't believe it, but we actually are already wrapping up. Yep. That flew by. I looked up and was like, oh goodness, time has flown. But I wanted to take a little bit of a look at the way that the directives play off of each other. So in this case, we have these 3 directives. How do they reinforce each other in addressing housing financialization? And we can expand beyond just the 3, but I'm just curious, how do they reinforce each other, in addressing this?
I think they create the entirety of a framework. I think it's hard we talked at the start about how what's needed is a complete system shift. And without implementing each and every one of these directives, it's hard to get to that place where you're not creating a loophole or a gap or a grey area, which we've seen in the past will allow investment in. Investors will latch on to any ambiguity within policy and in practice to continue to profit off of housing. So, we tried to create a kind of holistic document that covered, and that's not to say the directives cover every single area. We have other areas that we want to maybe introduce in the future, create new directives, particularly on things like climate. I think it's really important to have a specific directive related to climate. But we try to think of how, when you're going about this mammoth task of housing systems change, how do you actually do that? How do you move governments away from this approach? I often think of governments as having invested so much political capital in their existing approach to housing, to this financialized model. They're almost like gamblers chasing their losses, right? They just have to kind of keep on going and keep on going, keep on putting the money in. And I suppose in that example, the government is the gambler chasing his losses. The investors are quite literally the house, right? The house always wins, and what's being gambled away is people's lives, it's people's dignity, it's people's security. So we needed to create a new way, this human rights-based approach, this framework that would help governments really move away from that, give them clear guidance on how to do that in each and every area where it's going to be necessary.
Yeah, that's Absolutely perfect. I couldn't think of a better way to wrap things up on this first section. That's the house always wins, right? That's wonderful. So we're going to be back to talk about more directives because we wanted to break everything up. It would be a lot to try to tackle them all at once. But thank you both so much for making the time to talk today about these three. And I'm really excited to delve into what comes next, which is Directive 7. It's about tenants, everybody. So I encourage you to tune in next week to hear all about Directive 7. I'm very keen to talk about it, and we'll talk to you soon.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Kirsten. It's been really fun.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Wow, this was very interesting and inspiring, and hopefully many of our listeners will send these directives on and wait for the next episode.
Exactly. There's more to come on the Shift Directives.
And how do we get people to listen to our podcast?
Yeah, we need more listeners. We need more listeners. And the best way for that to happen is for each of our current listeners to text a friend or two and recommend the podcast. It is, I've been reflecting on the podcast myself recently, and this is a good little podcast, and we need more listeners. We need to get the word out that we're producing this out of love, not money, or for love, not money.
And we have downloads in 161 countries, so it's a truly global podcast. And we have the biggest audiences in Canada, US, UK, and Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, and on down. But I mean, we can carry more people from more countries and more from every country. So please share it. And also this podcast world helps if you subscribe and if you also rate it and all these different things you can do on the platform. So please help out with that. And the next episode is coming up very soon. But have a great day, Leilani, over there in the big snowy Canada.
Not snowy yet, but thanks.
No, not yet, yeah. But for me, it's always winter in Canada. You know that. Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.